The story really begins decades earlier, far from the Mississippi River and the smoke of the factory. It begins in 1837, inside a small blacksmith shop in Grand Detour, Illinois. The air inside the forge was thick with heat and the metallic scent of burning coal. Every strike of the hammer rang sharp and bright against the anvil, echoing out into the muddy street. Sparks leapt like fireflies in the dim light, while farmers waited outside with broken tools slung over their shoulders. They were desperate. The prairie soil surrounding the settlement was unlike anything they had known back east. It looked rich and dark, almost black, but it clung to cast-iron plows like wet clay. Every few feet the blade would choke with sticky earth. Farmers had to stop their oxen, scrape the mud away by hand, and start again, over and over, hour after hour. The land that was supposed to make them wealthy was defeating them instead. Inside the shop, a blacksmith named John Deere watched it happen day after day. He listened to the frustration in their voices and studied the ruined tools piling up at his door. To him, the problem wasn't the farmers, and it wasn't the land. It was the metal. Cast iron was rough and pitted. The soil clung to it. What the prairie needed was something smoother, something that could slice through the earth and clean itself as it moved. The solution arrived in the most ordinary way imaginable. At a nearby sawmill, a broken steel saw blade lay discarded in a pile of scrap. Most people saw junk. John Deere saw possibility. Back in the forge, the blade glowed dull red in the fire. Hammer strikes echoed into the night as he reshaped the steel, bending and polishing it until the surface shone like a mirror. He attached the curved blade to a wooden plow frame and carried it into a nearby field for a test. When the blade cut into the prairie, the soil slid off its polished surface as if it had been oiled. The plow moved forward without clogging, leaving a clean, perfect furrow behind it. For the first time, the prairie gave way. Word spread quickly across the frontier. Farmers who had been ready to abandon the land lined up outside the shop, asking for the new steel plow. The small forge filled with the constant rhythm of production as orders piled higher and higher. The tool that unlocked the American Midwest had been born in a one-room workshop filled with smoke and sparks. But solving the farmer's problem created a new one. Demand was growing faster than a single blacksmith shop could ever handle, and the quiet forge in Grand Detour was about to become something much larger.
Demand didn't grow slowly. It surged like a flood. Inside the small shop in Grand Detour, the sound of hammer on steel became constant. Orders piled up faster than the forge could keep up with. Farmers traveled miles, sometimes days, just to place their names on a waiting list. Wagons crowded the muddy road outside, their wheels sunk deep into the prairie soil the new plow had finally conquered. The workshop that once smelled of horseshoes and broken shovels now smelled of hot steel and urgency. John Deere realized something unsettling. The invention that saved the farmers was about to outgrow the man who created it. The prairie stretched endlessly in every direction, and every acre needed the same tool. A single blacksmith shop, no matter how busy, could never satisfy the hunger spreading across the Midwest. If the plow was going to reach the frontier, the forge would have to become a factory. In 1848, he made the decision that would quietly reshape the future of the company. He moved the entire operation to the river town of Moline, Illinois. The Mississippi River was not chosen for beauty. It was chosen for movement. Barges could carry heavy steel upstream. Rail lines were beginning to snake across the country. Raw materials could arrive faster. Finished plows could leave in bulk. The quiet rhythm of a workshop was replaced by the constant motion of industrial logistics. The first factory rose near the riverbank like a dark, humming machine. Inside, coal furnaces burned day and night. Belts spun overhead. Metal rang against metal in an endless mechanical chorus. The air tasted of smoke and iron filings. Production no longer followed the pace of a craftsman's hands. It followed the rhythm of demand. The transformation was irreversible. What had started as a solution for struggling farmers was becoming an industrial force. Shipments of plows began traveling far beyond Illinois, reaching new settlements, pushing westward across the continent. Every crate that left the riverfront carried the same promise: the prairie could be conquered. But the success that built the factory also built a new kind of pressure. The forge was no longer just a place of invention. It was now responsible for an entire growing workforce, a town, and a reputation that could not afford to fail. And as the factory expanded along the Mississippi, the family behind it began to change with it. By 1872, the factory along the Mississippi had become a permanent force in Moline. The furnaces burned day and night, and the town below the limestone ridge moved to the rhythm of the machinery. It was during this moment of expansion that Charles Deere made a decision that would define the identity of the family for generations. He decided to build a mansion, but not in the countryside, not beside a quiet lake, not hidden behind trees and distance like the estates of other industrial families. He chose the bluff directly above the factory. The location was impossible to misunderstand. From the ridge, the entire industrial complex stretched across the riverbank below. Chimneys, foundries, rail spurs, warehouses, and the constant movement of workers streaming through the gates at dawn. The mansion was named Overlook, and the name was literal. The house itself was elegant, built in a Swiss chalet style, with steep roofs, carved woodwork, and wide windows designed to capture sweeping views of the Mississippi River Valley. Inside, the rooms were filled with polished wood, heavy carpets, and imported furniture. It was the kind of residence that signaled wealth, stability, and permanence. But the most important design choice wasn't the architecture. It was the direction of the windows. The largest windows in the house faced the factory. From his study, Charles Deere could see the smokestacks rising above the river. He could watch the morning shift arrive. He could study the color and thickness of the smoke drifting into the sky. The mansion wasn't just a home. It was an observation post. The sounds of production climbed the hill each day. Trip hammers pounded steel into shape, their deep rhythmic impacts traveling through the limestone ridge and into the foundations of the house. The vibration was subtle but constant. Glassware trembled in cabinets. Floorboards carried a faint hum. Even in the quietest rooms, the factory could still be felt. And then there was the soot. Coal smoke rolled uphill with the wind, settling into curtains and carpets, leaving a faint gray dust on windowsills and banisters. Servants cleaned constantly, but the residue always returned. The air carried the unmistakable scent of burning coal, sharp, dry, and permanent. To Charles Deere, it was the smell of success. But for the family living inside the mansion, the house was becoming something else entirely. It was not a retreat from the factory. It was a front-row seat to it. Living inside the mansion meant living inside the rhythm of the factory. Morning did not begin with birds or quiet sunlight. It began with the whistle, a long, piercing blast that rolled up the bluff and echoed through the halls, announcing the start of another shift below. Servants paused. Curtains fluttered slightly in the draft from open windows. Somewhere in the distance, the heavy doors of the factory swung open, and hundreds of boots struck the ground in unison. The day had started, whether the family was ready or not. At breakfast, crystal glasses trembled almost imperceptibly on the dining table as trip hammers began their steady percussion. The vibration was faint but constant, like a second heartbeat running beneath the house. Plates clinked softly against silverware. Conversations learned to exist around the rhythm of distant metal striking metal. Silence never truly existed at Overlook. By midday, the smoke had climbed the hill again. Thin gray dust gathered along the edges of window frames, despite constant cleaning. Fresh linens laid out for lunch lost their brightness before the meal was finished. Velvet drapes carried a faint, permanent scent of coal. The wind determined how strong the reminder would be each day, but the reminder always came. The factory was never out of sight, and it was never out of mind. From his study window, Charles Deere watched everything. The stream of workers entering and leaving the gates, the movement of rail cars along the river, the color of the smoke drifting upward from the furnaces. Thick and dark meant the fires were hot and production was strong. Thin or pale meant trouble, a slowdown, a delay, a problem somewhere deep in the machinery. The house was positioned so that the business could be seen at all times, and slowly the family began to live as though they were part of the machinery too. Dinner conversations circled back to shipments, production numbers, and factory news. Visitors who arrived expecting a peaceful estate quickly realized that the pulse of industry followed them into every room. Even celebrations carried the distant soundtrack of manufacturing. Children grew up measuring time by the factory whistle. Seasons were marked not only by weather, but by production cycles. The boundary between home and workplace faded until it was almost impossible to see where one ended and the other began. The mansion had been built to demonstrate success, but over time it began to feel more like a permanent reminder of responsibility. And for the next generation growing up inside those walls, responsibility would not feel optional. Responsibility arrived early for the next generation. Inside the nursery rooms of the mansion, childhood unfolded under the same distant thunder that had shaped their parents' lives. Toys rested on polished wooden floors, while the steady percussion of the factory rolled up the hill in the background. Even at night, when the machinery slowed, the faint hum of industry lingered like a memory that refused to fade. The children of the Deere family were surrounded by comfort, but comfort came with expectations woven into every corner of the house. From the upper windows, the factory dominated the view. Long before they could fully understand the scale of the business, they understood the weight of it. They saw the smokestacks before they learned the names of distant cities. They heard the whistle before they learned to read. The message was never spoken directly, but it was always present. This is yours. One day it will depend on you. When Charles Deere grew older, the responsibility sharpened into pressure. He had watched his father transform a workshop into an industrial giant. Now he was expected to expand it further, protect it, and never allow it to falter. The mansion that once symbolized achievement became something more demanding, a place where every decision felt connected to thousands of livelihoods beyond the bluff. Then the burden shifted again. William Wiman entered the story not as a son born into the dynasty, but as a man who married into it. When he joined the family, he inherited not only wealth and influence, but the constant expectation that came with the view from the windows. The factory still roared below. The workers still filled the gates each morning. The responsibility still climbed the hill with the smoke. He stepped into leadership, knowing that the legacy he carried had been forged by men who measured themselves against impossible standards. The pressure was relentless. Running a growing industrial empire meant navigating labor disputes, fluctuating markets, and the constant demand for innovation. Days blurred into nights inside offices and factory floors. The house above the bluff remained illuminated long after the town had gone dark. Stress became a permanent resident of the mansion. When Deere-Wiman died at just 44 years old, the shock traveled through the family like a sudden silence after years of noise. The man tasked with carrying the dynasty forward had been worn down by the weight of the responsibility he inherited. The mansion on the hill remained standing, but the sense of security it once symbolized began to feel fragile. And the greatest test of the family's endurance was still approaching. The greatest test arrived with silence. In 1929, the crash of the stock market rippled outward until it reached the farms that had built the company in the first place. Across the Midwest, fields went untended, crops failed. Families who once lined up to buy new equipment suddenly struggled just to hold on to their land. Orders slowed, then stopped. And for the first time in generations, the smokestacks below the mansion began to go quiet. The change was immediate and unsettling. The factory whistle that had marked the start of every morning sounded less often. The steady percussion of trip hammers faded into long stretches of stillness. The ground beneath the house no longer trembled with constant motion. Rooms that had once vibrated with distant energy felt unnaturally calm. The silence felt heavier than the noise ever had. From the windows of the mansion, the view had transformed. Rail cars sat idle along the tracks. Fewer workers passed through the gates. The river moved at its usual pace, but the machinery that once defined the town seemed to hesitate. Inside the house, lights burned late into the night. Decisions had to be made that would affect not only the family's fortune, but the survival of the entire community below the bluff. The responsibility that had shaped generations of the family now pressed down with renewed force. Charles Deere-Wiman faced the crisis with a choice that carried enormous risk. Instead of shutting the factory and sending workers home, he kept production moving as long as possible. When money ran thin, the company issued paychecks backed only by promise, pledges that workers would be paid when the economy recovered. It was a gamble built on faith in the land, the farmers, and the belief that the prairie would recover. For years, the mansion became a place of quiet vigilance. Gone were the lively gatherings and celebrations. The long windows that once overlooked roaring industry now framed uncertainty. Nights stretched longer as the future of the company and the town itself hung in the balance. Eventually, the economy began to stir again. Orders returned. The smokestacks slowly came back to life. The rhythm of industry crept back into the valley, and the ground beneath the house began to tremble once more. The company survived, but something inside the family had changed forever.
Survival did not bring relief the way anyone expected. By the time the factory roared back to life, the relationship between the family and the mansion had quietly shifted. For decades, the house on the bluff had symbolized vigilance, responsibility, and the constant need to watch over the machine below. But after years of crisis and anxiety, the view that once represented success began to feel exhausting. The smoke returned, the whistle returned, the vibration in the floors returned, and this time the family no longer saw comfort in it. A new generation began to question a tradition that had lasted nearly a century. They had grown up in rooms where the windows framed smokestacks instead of gardens. They had lived in a house where the rhythm of machinery set the pace of daily life. The mansion had never truly been a place of escape. It had always been tied to the factory in a way that made distance impossible. Slowly, the decision formed. They would leave the bluff. The departure was not dramatic. There was no single moment when the doors closed for the last time. Instead, the connection loosened gradually as family members moved to quieter neighborhoods, seeking homes where the air did not carry the scent of coal and the ground did not hum with distant machinery. The mansion remained behind, large and quiet, overlooking a factory that no longer needed a watchtower. Eventually, the estate was given a new purpose. The house that had once functioned as a private command post became a public space, opening its doors as a museum and historical center. Visitors walked through rooms that had once held the weight of industrial decisions and family expectations. They stood at the same windows that had framed the rise and survival of an empire. But even without the family inside, the atmosphere of the house never fully softened. The walls still felt serious, the view still carried a sense of duty, and the mansion continued to watch the factory below, just as it always had.
Today, the factory below the bluff still produces the green machines that work fields across the world. Modern tractors roll off assembly lines and travel thousands of miles to farms on nearly every continent. The company that began with a single polished steel plow has become a global symbol of agriculture, innovation, and reliability. Yet the mansion above the river remains almost unchanged. Visitors walk through its heavy wooden doors and step into rooms where the air still feels formal and deliberate. Sunlight pours through the same wide windows that once framed smokestacks and rail cars. The view is quieter now, softened by time and distance, but the connection between the house and the factory is impossible to ignore. It stands as a reminder that the John Deere empire was never built far away from the work that created it. It was built directly beside it, above it, and often inside it. The family that lived there achieved what the first blacksmith had dreamed of: security, permanence, and freedom from the fear of poverty. Their machines helped transform the American Midwest into one of the most productive agricultural regions on Earth. Their name became known in fields thousands of miles from the Mississippi River. But the mansion on the bluff tells the other side of the story. It shows how success can demand constant vigilance, how responsibility can follow a family across generations, how the pursuit of stability can quietly shape the way people live, work, and define home. The forge is gone, the soot no longer drifts through the curtains, but the legacy remains, carried forward by every tractor that crosses a field and every farmer who depends on it. The house still watches the factory. And this mansion is not the only American estate built to overlook an empire.